The rescue beacon died at 3:47 hours, its final electronic whimper swallowed by the mountainous terrain of the Kandahar province. Somewhere in that jagged landscape, Captain Kira, Viper, Thorn lay broken beside the twisted wreckage of her F-16 Fighting Falcon, her ejection seat having carried her away from $37 million of burning American steel and into a nightmare that would reshape military doctrine forever. The Pentagon brass would later call it a routine reconnaissance mission. The Taliban called it an invitation. But for the woman who had clawed her way through every glass ceiling the Air Force could construct, it was about to become something else entirely. A legend written in blood and determination that would echo through the halls of military academies for generations. 3 days earlier, Viper had been just another pilot in the 421st Fighter Squadron, enduring the same tired jokes about women in combat that had followed her from flight school to deployment. Her squadron mates tolerated her competence while questioning her presence, their respect conditional, and their trust earned one successful mission at a time. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 12 years proving she belonged in the cockpit, only to find herself fighting for acceptance in a war zone where survival trumped politics. The mission briefing had been standard: low-altitude reconnaissance over suspected insurgent positions, radio silence maintained, extraction coordinates pre-programmed. Intelligence suggested minimal ground activity. The weather forecast promised clear skies. Every variable had been calculated, every contingency planned. What they hadn't anticipated was the surface-to-air missile that would transform a routine flight into a test of everything Viper had learned about warfare, survival, and the price of underestimation. Now, as dawn broke over the Hindu Kush Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of amber and gold, the silence was deafening. No radio chatter filled her helmet. No engine noise vibrated through her bones. Just the whisper of wind through shattered metal and the distant echo of voices speaking a language she recognized but couldn't understand, voices that were getting closer. The Taliban patrol had been tracking the smoke column since her aircraft had augured into the mountainside. They knew an American pilot was down. They knew she was alone. What they didn't know was that they were about to encounter a woman who had transformed every obstacle into opportunity, every slight into strength, and who would now transform their certainty into the gravest miscalculation of their lives. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus "Brick" Morrison received the distress call at Forward Operating Base Chapman while pouring his third cup of coffee that morning. The static-filled transmission lasted exactly 14 seconds before cutting to silence, but those 14 seconds contained enough information to turn his stomach and mobilize half the base. Viper down, grid coordinates 34.5231 by 69.1783, aircraft total loss, pilot status unknown, emergency beacon active. Brick had flown with Viper during their stateside training, had watched her navigate the invisible minefield of military sexism with the same precision she applied to aerial combat. She was good, better than good, but the old-school mentality still questioned whether women possessed the physical and psychological fortitude for survival in hostile territory. Today, that question would receive its definitive answer. The rescue operation launched within 20 minutes. Two A-60 Black Hawks lifted off into the crisp morning air, their rotors chopping through the silence that had settled over the base like a heavy blanket. Major Elena Vasquez, the base's senior intelligence officer, studied the tactical display with growing concern. The crash site lay deep in Taliban-controlled territory, surrounded by terrain that made helicopter insertion nearly impossible and ground extraction a suicide mission. "How long can she survive out there?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that kept him awake at night. Vasquez traced the topographic lines with her finger, calculating distances and probable enemy response times. "Depends on her condition, her training, and how badly they want her. But sir, we're talking about Viper. She's got more fight in her than most of our ground troops." The search and rescue coordinator, Master Sergeant Jake Hallbrook, had been coordinating extractions for 15 years. He'd seen pilots break under pressure, watched trained warriors crumble when faced with capture. But something about this mission felt different. The pilot's voice on that final transmission had been steady, controlled, almost eerily calm. "She's not just surviving out there," he told his team. "She's planning something." Meanwhile, 40 kilometers away, Viper was indeed planning. The impact had shattered her left arm and opened a gash across her forehead that painted her vision red, but her mind remained sharp. She'd cataloged her resources: one sidearm with 2 clips, emergency rations for 3 days, basic medical supplies, and the knife her grandfather had carried in Korea. Most importantly, she had terrain that favored defense and the element of surprise. The Taliban patrol consisted of 12 fighters, moving with the confidence of men who believed they were hunting wounded prey. Their leader, a weathered veteran named Mahmud, had captured 2 American pilots before. He expected the usual pattern: initial bravado followed by rapid psychological collapse. American pilots, he'd learned, were trained to fly machines, not to fight with their hands. Viper watched them approach through the scope of her rifle, counting weapons and assessing their tactical formation. They moved like hunters, not soldiers, assuming their quarry would be hiding, not hunting. She smiled grimly, ignoring the blood that dripped from her chin. They were about to learn that this particular prey had different ideas about the nature of their relationship. The first Taliban fighter died without knowing what hit him. Viper's rifle barked once from a concealed position 30 meters above the crash site, and the point man simply crumpled into the rocks. The silence that followed was pregnant with confusion and dawning realization. This wasn't going to be a simple capture mission. Mahmud barked orders in Pashto, his voice carrying the authority of experience and the edge of uncertainty. His remaining 11 fighters spread into a defensive perimeter, their confidence shaken by the sudden reversal of roles. The American pilot wasn't cowering in the wreckage waiting for rescue, she was fighting back. From her rocky perch, Viper controlled the high ground and the tactical initiative. She'd chosen her position carefully, using the morning sun to blind approaching enemies while providing herself with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. The Taliban had numbers, but she had training terrain, and the burning determination of someone who had spent her entire career proving she belonged in the fight. The psychological warfare began immediately. Using her grandfather's lessons about patience and precision, she waited 47 minutes before taking her second shot. The extended silence worked on the Taliban fighters' nerves, turning their numerical advantage into a liability as they struggled to maintain formation while scanning for threats from an invisible enemy. When the second fighter fell, Mahmud began to understand that he wasn't hunting an injured pilot. He was being hunted by a predator who had turned the mountains into her weapon. The realization came too late to save his men, but early enough to save his own life if he possessed the wisdom to withdraw. Viper's voice crackled through the radio static at 6:23 hours, her transmission brief and professional. Any station, this is Viper. I'm alive, I'm fighting, and I'm not going anywhere." The words carried across the airwaves to 3 separate military installations, igniting a firestorm of activity that would reshape the entire rescue operation. At FOB Chapman, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in years of combat operations: genuine awe. The pilot who had endured countless jokes about women in combat was now demonstrating exactly why those jokes had always been hollow. She wasn't just surviving, she was winning. The Taliban's third casualty came when they attempted to flank her position. Viper had anticipated the maneuver. Using the terrain's natural choke points to force them into a killing zone, she'd prepared with methodical precision. The insurgent stumbled into her improvised trap, a carefully balanced rock slide triggered by a simple wire mechanism, and disappeared beneath tons of mountain stone. Mahmud's remaining fighters were beginning to question their mission. The American pilot had killed 3 of their number without exposing herself to return fire, had demonstrated tactical awareness that exceeded their own, and showed no signs of the psychological breakdown they'd expected. Worse, she seemed to be enjoying herself. "She's not human," one fighter whispered in Pashto, his voice carrying the superstitious dread of men who had encountered something beyond their understanding. Viper, monitoring their radio chatter through her survival radio, allowed herself a cold smile. She'd been called many things during her military career, most of them intended as insults, but she'd never been called inhuman. There was a certain poetic justice in the fact that the men who had questioned her humanity were now the ones using that word to describe her capabilities. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in harsh light that favored the defender. Viper had conserved her ammunition, taking only shots that guaranteed kills while using the terrain to multiply her tactical advantages. She was fighting a different kind of war now, not the technological superiority of aerial combat, but the primal struggle of hunter versus hunted. Her radio crackled with incoming traffic. "Viper, this is Rescue 1. We have your position. Hang tight, we're coming for you." "Negative, Rescue 1, she replied, her voice steady despite the blood loss and exhaustion. "I'm not going anywhere and neither are they. Give me time to finish this." The rescue coordinator's voice carried disbelief and growing respect. "Viper, you're injured and outnumbered. We can extract you now." "They started this fight," Viper responded, chambering another round. "I'm going to finish it." Major Elena Vasquez listened to the radio exchange with growing amazement. The pilot who had been written off as a casualty was now controlling the tactical situation with such effectiveness that the rescue mission had become a support operation. "Sir," she told Morrison, "I think we're about to witness something unprecedented." The Taliban's 4th fighter died attempting to use the wreckage as cover. Viper had anticipated this move as well, having booby-trapped the aircraft with explosive charges from her ejection seat. The blast echoed across the valley like thunder, sending a message that resonated far beyond the immediate battlefield. This pilot was not merely surviving, she was systematically dismantling her enemies. Mahmud called for reinforcements, his voice carrying the strain of a commander who had underestimated his enemy. The radio response was immediate. 2 additional squads were en route, bringing the total enemy force to 36 fighters. The odds were about to shift dramatically against the lone American pilot. Viper monitored the enemy communications and smiled. More enemies meant more opportunities to demonstrate that their fundamental assumptions about American pilots and about women in combat were catastrophically wrong. She checked her remaining ammunition, assessed her defensive positions, and prepared for the next phase of a battle that was already being discussed in hushed tones at military installations across the region. The sun continued its arc across the Afghan sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. But for the woman who had spent her career fighting for recognition and respect, this mountain had become the stage where she would finally, definitively, prove that she belonged in the fight. The reinforcements arrived at 8:47 hours. 36 Taliban fighters spread across the valley floor in a formation that should have overwhelmed any defensive position. Their leader, a former Afghan army officer named Rashid, had trained under Soviet advisors and understood military tactics in ways that Mahmud's guerrilla fighters did not. He surveyed the battlefield with professional interest, noting the precise placement of his predecessor's casualties and the elegant tactical advantage the pilot had established. "She's very good," he told his lieutenants, studying the crash site through binoculars. "But she's still just one woman with limited ammunition against 36 men. Mathematics will prevail." Viper watched the new arrivals deploy with the efficiency of trained soldiers rather than the rough enthusiasm of insurgents. Her tactical situation had shifted from favorable to desperate, but her resolve remained unchanged. She'd spent 12 years proving she belonged in the cockpit. Now she had the opportunity to prove she belonged in the history books. The first coordinated assault came at 9:03 hours. Rashid's forces moved with professional precision, using covering fire and tactical formations that would have overwhelmed most defensive positions. But Viper had transformed the mountainside into a fortress, using every natural feature to channel her enemies into predetermined killing zones. Her seventh kill came when she triggered a carefully prepared rockslide that caught 3 fighters in a natural bottleneck. The sound of shifting stone mixed with screams and gunfire, creating a symphony of destruction that echoed across the valley. The Taliban advance stalled as survivors struggled to reorganize under fire from an enemy they couldn't locate. "She's not fighting like a pilot," Rashid observed, his professional admiration tinged with growing concern. "She's fighting like a special forces operative. Where did they train her?" The answer lay in Viper's unconventional background. Before joining the Air Force, she'd spent 4 years in the Marine Corps, earning her initial combat experience in urban warfare environments that rewarded adaptation and improvisation. Her pilot training had added technological sophistication to a foundation of ground combat skills that few of her aerial colleagues possessed. The second assault wave faced a different challenge. Viper had exhausted her prepared positions and now relied on movement and concealment, using the terrain's natural features to remain invisible while maintaining offensive pressure. She'd become a ghost in the rocks, appearing long enough to take a shot before vanishing into the mountain's embrace. Her radio crackled with updates from the Rescue Coordination Center. "Viper, we're tracking 30-plus hostiles converging on your position. Our birds are 15 minutes out. Can you hold?" "I'm not holding," she replied, her voice carrying a confidence that defied her tactical situation. "I'm hunting. Keep those helicopters back until I clear the landing zone." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison listened to the exchange with growing disbelief. The pilot, who had been considered a diversity hire by some of his peers, was now controlling a battlefield with such skill that she was dictating the terms of her own rescue. "Get me a direct line to the Pentagon," he told his communications officer. "They need to hear this." The Taliban's 8th casualty came when Viper used their own tactics against them. She'd salvaged an RPG from one of the earlier casualties, using it to devastating effect against fighters who had clustered for their next assault. The explosion sent bodies flying and morale plummeting, as survivors realized they were being systematically dismantled by someone who understood their own methods better than they did. Rashid's tactical assessment was evolving from professional interest to genuine concern. The American pilot had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded her training profile, displaying an understanding of mountain warfare that suggested extensive specialized instruction. More troubling, she seemed to be adapting to his tactics faster than his fighters could implement them. "Fall back to defensive positions," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had recognized the need for a tactical reassessment. "We'll contain her until she exhausts her ammunition, then move in force." But Viper had no intention of allowing herself to be contained. She'd identified the command element through careful observation of the enemy's communication patterns, and was now moving to eliminate the tactical leadership that threatened to turn her numerical disadvantage into an insurmountable challenge. The mountains had become her ally, providing concealment and tactical advantage that multiplied her effectiveness far beyond what conventional military doctrine suggested was possible. She was rewriting the rules of engagement with every successful maneuver, proving that training, determination, and tactical intelligence could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Her 9th kill was the most audacious yet. Working her way through natural cover, she'd positioned herself within 50 meters of the enemy command post, close enough to hear their tactical discussions and identify priority targets. The Taliban leader fell to a single, precisely placed shot that eliminated their tactical coordination and sent the remaining fighters into confused retreat. The silence that followed was different from the pauses between earlier engagements. This was the silence of demoralization, of fighters who had begun to question whether they were hunting prey or being hunted by a predator beyond their understanding. The American pilot had transformed from victim to nemesis, using their own battlefield against them with surgical precision. Viper's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. "Viper, this is Rescue 1. We have visual on your position. The landing zone appears clear. Are you ready for extraction?" She surveyed the battlefield, counting the remaining fighters who had withdrawn to defensive positions beyond her immediate reach. 9 Taliban casualties lay scattered across the mountainside, testament to the effectiveness of preparation, training, and the refusal to accept defeat. But more importantly, she had proven something that transcended tactical victory. "Rescue 1, this is Viper," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had answered every question about her capabilities. "I'm ready for pickup. The landing zone is secure." The Black Hawks materialized from the morning sky like mechanical angels, their rotors beating a rhythm that announced the arrival of salvation. But salvation, Viper knew, was something she had earned through her own actions rather than something that had been granted by others. As the rescue team fast-roped to the ground, she remained in overwatch position, her rifle trained on the distant Taliban positions until the last possible moment. Even in rescue, she maintained the tactical discipline that had kept her alive and transformed a potential disaster into an unprecedented victory. The rescue medic who reached her first was Staff Sergeant Patricia Martinez, a veteran of numerous combat extractions who had seen every possible condition of rescued personnel. What she found defied her experience: a pilot who was injured but alert, exhausted but still tactically engaged, and whose first concern was providing intelligence on remaining enemy positions. "Ma'am, we need to get you medical attention," Martinez said, assessing the extent of Viper's injuries with professional efficiency. "Negative," Viper replied, keeping her rifle trained on the distant ridgeline. "Not until we're airborne. There are still 27 hostiles in the area, and they're not going to let us leave without a fight." The rescue team leader, Master Sergeant Jake Hallbrook, had coordinated hundreds of extractions during his 15-year career. He'd never encountered a pilot who remained in tactical control during their own rescue, much less one who had single-handedly eliminated a significant enemy force. "Ma'am, with respect, you've done enough. Let us handle the extraction." Viper's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Sergeant, I've spent the last 4 hours turning this mountain into a fortress. I know every sight line, every approach route, and every place those fighters might use for an ambush. You're not leaving here without my tactical guidance." The Black Hawks hovered overhead, their door gunners scanning for threats while the rescue team worked with unprecedented efficiency. But even as they prepared for departure, Viper maintained her overwatch position, refusing to board until every member of the rescue team was safely aboard. Her final act on the battlefield was characteristic of everything that had preceded it. As the helicopters lifted off, she tossed her grandfather's knife toward the Taliban positions, not in surrender, but as a message. The blade embedded itself in a rock formation visible from the enemy's defensive positions, a symbol that would be found weeks later by intelligence teams and photographed for inclusion in after-action reports. The flight back to Fob Chapman passed in relative silence, the usual post-rescue chatter subdued by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Viper sat quietly in the helicopter's troop compartment, her injuries being treated by medics who worked with the reverence typically reserved for wounded heroes. But she wasn't thinking about her injuries or her rescue. She was thinking about the 9 Taliban fighters who had underestimated her capabilities and paid the ultimate price for their assumptions. More importantly, she was thinking about the broader implications of what had happened on that mountain, the questions it answered, and the precedents it established for women in combat. The helicopter's radio crackled with incoming traffic from higher command levels. Word of the engagement had traveled quickly through military channels, generating interest from Pentagon officials who rarely concerned themselves with individual tactical actions. But this wasn't just a tactical action, it was a paradigm shift. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the radio static. "Viper, this is base command. Outstanding work out there. We're going to need a full debrief when you're medically cleared." "Copy that, sir," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had proven every point that needed proving. "I'll be ready whenever you are." As the FOB Chapman came into view, Viper reflected on the morning's events with the tactical detachment that had served her so well in combat. She had survived an aircraft crash, fought off a superior enemy force, and coordinated her own rescue. But more than that, she had definitively answered every question about women's capabilities in ground combat. The Black Hawks touched down on the landing pad with the gentleness of machines operated by pilots who understood they were carrying someone special. As Viper was helped from the aircraft, she was greeted by a crowd of personnel who had gathered to witness the return of someone who had already achieved legendary status. Major Elena Vasquez was among the first to reach her, professional curiosity mixing with personal admiration. "Viper, we monitored your radio traffic throughout the engagement. How did you maintain tactical control under those conditions?" Viper's response was characteristic of her personality, direct, honest, and focused on the mission rather than personal recognition. "Ma'am, I did what I was trained to do. The Taliban made assumptions about my capabilities that proved to be incorrect. I simply took advantage of their mistakes." The medical team that escorted her to the base hospital worked with the efficiency of professionals who understood they were treating someone whose actions would be studied in military academies for decades. Her injuries were significant but not life-threatening: a broken arm, multiple lacerations, and the inevitable effects of combat stress. But her condition was remarkably stable for someone who had spent 4 hours in sustained combat. As the medical staff worked, Viper's mind remained focused on the tactical lessons of the morning's engagement. She had proven that preparation, training, and tactical intelligence could overcome numerical disadvantage. But more importantly, she had demonstrated that gender was irrelevant when it came to combat effectiveness. The base commander, Colonel William Harrison, arrived at the medical facility within minutes of her arrival. A veteran of 3 combat deployments, he had seen enough combat to recognize exceptional performance when he encountered it. "Captain Thorne, I want you to know that your actions today have set a new standard for what we expect from our pilots." Viper's response reflected the humility that had carried her through 12 years of military service. "Sir, I simply did my job. The Taliban created a tactical situation that required adaptation, and I adapted. Any pilot in the squadron would have done the same." But Harrison knew better. He'd reviewed the preliminary reports, studied the tactical situation, and understood that what had occurred on that mountain transcended normal military performance. "Captain, what you did out there wasn't just exceptional, it was unprecedented. You've changed the conversation about women in combat forever." The words carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate military context. Viper had spent her entire career fighting for recognition and respect, enduring countless subtle and not-so-subtle challenges to her presence in military aviation. Today, she had answered every question about her capabilities with actions that spoke louder than any argument. As the medical team finished their initial assessment, Viper was cleared for the extensive debriefing that would follow. But first, she requested a few minutes to process the morning's events privately. She needed time to transition from the tactical mindset that had kept her alive to the analytical framework that would be required for the inevitable after-action analysis. The small private room where she was left to rest provided the first quiet moment she'd experienced since her aircraft had been hit. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had occurred, not just the tactical victory, but the personal vindication that came with proving every point that had ever needed proving. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock on the door. Staff Sergeant Martinez entered, carrying a cup of coffee and the kind of respectful demeanor that Viper had rarely encountered during her military career. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for what you did out there. You didn't just save yourself, you saved all of us." Viper's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Sergeant, we all did our jobs. I just had a longer work day than most." But Martinez understood the broader implications of what had occurred. "Ma'am, with respect, what you did out there changed everything. Every woman in the military is going to benefit from what you proved today." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, who had come to escort Viper to the debriefing room where senior staff awaited her tactical analysis. As they walked through the base, Viper noticed the change in how personnel reacted to her presence, the respectful nods, the genuine interest, the complete absence of the skepticism that had followed her throughout her career. The debriefing room was filled with officers who had gathered to hear first-hand accounts of tactics and techniques that would be studied for years to come. But as Viper began her methodical analysis of the morning's events, she realized that the most important lesson had nothing to do with tactical procedures or combat techniques. "The Taliban made their initial tactical error," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about combat, "when they assumed that an American pilot would be helpless in a ground combat situation. Their second error was assuming that gender had any relevance to combat effectiveness." The room remained silent as she continued, her analysis becoming a masterclass in tactical thinking and strategic assessment. But beneath the professional presentation, everyone present understood they were witnessing something historic, not just a successful combat action, but a definitive answer to questions that had plagued military service for generations. The tactical debriefing lasted 3 hours, during which Viper provided detailed analysis of every engagement, every tactical decision, and every lesson learned. Her presentation was methodical, professional, and comprehensive, but it was also deeply personal. She was sharing not just tactical knowledge, but the culmination of a lifetime's struggle for recognition and respect. When she finished, the room remained silent for several seconds before Colonel Harrison spoke. "Captain Thorne, your actions today have redefined what we understand about pilot capabilities and ground combat effectiveness. More importantly, you've proven that excellence knows no gender boundaries." Major Vasquez added her own assessment. "Ma'am, the tactical innovations you demonstrated today are going to be incorporated into our training programs immediately. You've contributed to military doctrine in ways that will save lives for years to come." But for Viper, the most important recognition came from Master Sergeant Holbrook, the rescue coordinator who had initially doubted her ability to survive in hostile territory. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today. You didn't just survive, you dominated." The words carried the weight of professional acknowledgement from someone who had seen every possible scenario in combat rescue operations. But they also carried the recognition that Viper had been seeking throughout her military career, acknowledgement that her capabilities were equal to any challenge and superior to most. As the debriefing concluded, Viper was escorted to temporary quarters where she could rest and recover from the morning's ordeal. But rest was difficult to achieve when adrenaline and pride mixed in equal measure, creating a psychological state that made sleep impossible and reflection inevitable. She thought about the 9 Taliban fighters who had died because they had underestimated her capabilities. She thought about the rescue team that had witnessed her tactical control during extraction. Most importantly, she thought about the broader implications of what had occurred, the questions answered, the barriers broken, and the precedents established. The knock on her door came at 14:30 hours, delivered by a communications specialist who carried a message that would change everything. "Ma'am, you have a call from the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense wants to speak with you personally." Viper's response was characteristically understated. "Tell the Secretary I'll be right there." But as she walked toward the communications center, she understood that this conversation would extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Today's events had created ripples that would spread throughout the military establishment, challenging assumptions and reshaping policies in ways that would benefit countless service members who would follow in her footsteps. The call from the Secretary of Defense lasted 23 minutes, during which Viper provided tactical analysis that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. But more importantly, she engaged in a conversation about women's roles in combat that would reshape Pentagon policy and military culture. "Captain Thorne," the secretary said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for the entire military establishment, "your actions today have provided definitive proof that gender is irrelevant to combat effectiveness. You've changed the conversation permanently." Viper's response reflected the humility that had carried her through 12 years of military service. "Sir, I simply did what any pilot would do in a similar situation. The Taliban created a tactical problem that required an adaptive solution." But the secretary understood the broader implications. "Captain, what you did today wasn't just adaptive, it was revolutionary. You've proven that women can not only survive in ground combat, but excel in ways that exceed traditional expectations." The conversation continued, covering tactical lessons, strategic implications, and the inevitable changes that would follow. But for Viper, the most important element was the recognition that her actions had created opportunities for countless other women who would follow in her footsteps. When the call ended, she found herself surrounded by base personnel who had gathered to express their personal appreciation for what she had accomplished. But the most meaningful recognition came from Major Vasquez, who had become something of a mentor during her deployment. "Viper," she said, her voice carrying the emotion of someone who understood the significance of what had occurred, "you've changed everything. Every woman in the military is going to benefit from what you proved today." The words carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate military context. Viper had spent her entire career fighting for recognition and respect, enduring countless challenges to her presence in military aviation. Today, she had answered every question about her capabilities with actions that would be studied for generations. As evening fell over Fob Chapman, Viper sat in the small recreation area where off-duty personnel gathered to decompress from the stresses of deployment. For the first time in her military career, she was surrounded by colleagues who looked at her with genuine respect rather than curiosity or skepticism. The conversation that developed was different from any she had experienced during her military service. Instead of questioning her capabilities or challenging her presence, her colleagues were asking for tactical advice, seeking her opinion on military matters, and treating her as the expert she had always been. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a recent graduate from the Air Force Academy, approached with the kind of reverence typically reserved for legendary figures. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for what you did today. You've shown all of us what's possible when we refuse to accept limitations." Viper's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Lieutenant, the only limitations that matter are the ones we impose on ourselves. Today proved that excellence has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with preparation, training, and determination." The conversation continued late into the evening, with personnel sharing stories, asking questions, and expressing gratitude for what had been accomplished. But for Viper, the most important element was the recognition that her actions had created a new standard for what was possible in military service. As she finally retired to her quarters, Viper reflected on the day's events with the satisfaction of someone who had proven every point that needed proving. She had survived an aircraft crash, fought off a superior enemy force, and coordinated her own rescue. But more importantly, she had definitively answered every question about women's capabilities in ground combat. The morning would bring new challenges, new questions, and new opportunities. But tonight, she rested with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had changed the conversation about women in combat forever. Her actions on that mountain had established precedents that would benefit countless service members who would follow in her footsteps. The knock on her door came at 5:30 hours, delivered by a young airman who carried orders that would change everything. "Ma'am, you're being reassigned to the Pentagon for a special assignment. Transportation leaves in 2 hours." Viper's response was characteristically professional. "Thank you, Airman. I'll be ready." But as she packed her gear, she understood that this reassignment represented more than just a change of duty station. Her actions had created opportunities and responsibilities that extended far beyond tactical aviation. She was being called to help reshape military doctrine and policy in ways that would benefit countless service members. The flight to Washington passed in contemplative silence, with Viper reviewing the events of the previous day and considering their broader implications. She had proven that women could excel in ground combat, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that excellence transcended gender boundaries in ways that would reshape military culture. The Pentagon assignment would last 6 months, during which Viper would work with senior staff to incorporate lessons learned from her engagement into training programs, tactical doctrine, and policy guidelines. But her most important contribution would be serving as living proof that military effectiveness had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with preparation, training, and determination. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of women's roles in combat, they would point to a specific date and location: the mountains of Kandahar province, where Captain Kira, Viper, Thorne proved that excellence knows no gender boundaries. Her actions had answered every question about women's capabilities in ground combat, establishing precedents that would benefit countless service members. The Taliban fighters who had underestimated her capabilities had paid the ultimate price for their assumptions. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. It had provided the definitive proof that military effectiveness transcended gender boundaries, and that excellence was a function of preparation, training, and determination, rather than physical characteristics. As Viper settled into her new assignment at the Pentagon, she carried with her the satisfaction of someone who had changed the conversation about women in combat forever. Her actions had created opportunities for countless other women who would follow in her footsteps, establishing precedents that would reshape military culture for generations. The mountain where she had fought her legendary battle would eventually be renamed in her honor, serving as a permanent reminder of what was possible when preparation met opportunity and determination overcame odds. But for Viper, the most important legacy was the knowledge that her actions had created a new standard for what was possible in military service. The final chapter of her story was still being written, with each successful mission flown by women pilots, each tactical innovation implemented by female officers, and each barrier broken by service members who had been inspired by her example. She had proven that excellence knows no gender boundaries, and that legacy would endure long after her service had ended. The mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed countless battles, but none had carried the significance of the engagement that would become known as the Viper Incident. It had changed military doctrine, reshaped cultural assumptions, and established precedents that would benefit countless service members who would follow in her footsteps. In the end, Captain Kira, Viper, Thorne had accomplished something that transcended tactical victory. She had proven that excellence knows no boundaries and that determination can overcome any obstacle. Her legacy would endure in the policies she helped shape, the precedents she established, and the countless service members who would benefit from her example. The story of her mountain battle spread through military channels with the speed of digital communication and the weight of historical significance. Within 72 hours, classified reports had reached every major command structure in the Department of Defense, generating discussions that would reshape military policy for decades to come. At the Air Force Academy, Brigadier General Rebecca Stone stood before a classroom of cadets, holding a photograph that would become iconic in military circles. The image showed Viper's knife embedded in the mountain rock, placed there during her extraction as a final message to the Taliban fighters who had underestimated her capabilities. This photograph, General Stone told the assembled cadets, represents the moment when theoretical arguments about women in combat became historical fact. Captain Thorne didn't just survive an impossible situation. She dominated it through superior tactics, unwavering determination, and the kind of professional excellence that transcends gender boundaries. The cadets listened with the rapt attention typically reserved for legendary war stories. But this wasn't just another tale of military heroism. This was proof that their own capabilities were limited only by their preparation, training, and willingness to exceed expectations when circumstances demanded exceptional performance. Lieutenant Colonel James "Hawk" Patterson, Viper's former squadron commander, found himself fielding questions from military journalists who were struggling to understand how a pilot they had considered competent but unremarkable had accomplished something that would be studied in military academies for generations. "The truth is," Patterson admitted during a recorded interview, "we underestimated her. We saw her gender before we saw her capabilities, and that blindness prevented us from recognizing that we had one of the most tactically gifted officers in the Air Force flying routine missions." The admission carried the weight of institutional acknowledgement that perceptions had been wrong and assumptions had been costly. But more importantly, it represented the beginning of a cultural shift that would reshape how military leadership evaluated personnel and assigned responsibilities. Master Sergeant Martinez, who had been part of the rescue team, provided her own perspective during the official after-action review. "Ma'am, when we reached her position, she wasn't acting like someone who had survived a crash. She was acting like someone who had won a battle. The difference was unmistakable." The tactical analysis that followed Viper's engagement revealed innovations that would be incorporated into military doctrine immediately. Her use of terrain, her psychological manipulation of enemy forces, and her ability to maintain tactical control while coordinating her own rescue demonstrated capabilities that exceeded conventional training parameters. Colonel Harrison, the base commander who had witnessed her return, submitted a report that would influence Pentagon policy for years. Captain Thorne's actions provide definitive proof that combat effectiveness has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with training, preparation, and mental toughness. Her performance exceeded that of most Special Forces personnel. The report's conclusions were supported by tactical analysis that revealed the mathematical impossibility of what Viper had accomplished. Facing odds of 36-1, with limited ammunition and significant injuries, she had eliminated 9 enemy fighters while coordinating her own rescue, a performance that defied conventional military probability assessments. The Pentagon briefing room, where Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams addressed senior staff, was filled with officers who had spent their careers questioning whether women possessed the physical and psychological attributes necessary for ground combat. Today, that question had been answered definitively. "Gentlemen," Secretary Williams began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought her own battles for recognition and respect, "Captain Thorne's actions have provided empirical proof that our previous assumptions about women in combat were fundamentally flawed. Excellence knows no gender boundaries." The room remained silent as she continued, her presentation becoming a masterclass in strategic thinking and policy development. But beneath the professional discussion, everyone present understood they were witnessing a paradigm shift that would reshape military culture for generations. General Michael Richardson, the Air Force Chief of Staff, added his own assessment. This engagement has demonstrated that our evaluation criteria need to focus on capability rather than physical characteristics. Captain Thorne has proven that tactical intelligence and mental toughness are more important than traditional measures of combat readiness. The policy changes that followed would be implemented across all service branches, establishing new standards for personnel evaluation that emphasized performance over perception. But for the women currently serving in military roles, the most important change was the recognition that their capabilities were no longer subject to question. Major Vasquez, who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel in recognition of her analytical contributions to the after-action review, found herself serving as a liaison between Pentagon officials and field commanders who were struggling to understand the implications of what had occurred. "The tactical lessons are important," she explained during a classified briefing, "but the cultural implications are revolutionary. Captain Thorne has changed the conversation about women in combat permanently. Every assumption has been proven wrong, and every barrier has been shown to be artificial." The training programs that were developed in response to Viper's engagement emphasized the psychological and tactical elements that had made her successful. But more importantly, they established new standards for what was possible when preparation met opportunity and determination overcame seemingly impossible odds. Staff Sergeant Kim, the young officer who had expressed gratitude for Viper's example, found herself assigned to a special project that would develop new training curricula based on lessons learned from the mountain engagement. Her role was to ensure that future generations of service members would benefit from the tactical innovation that had emerged from that legendary battle. "Ma'am," she told Colonel Harrison during a project briefing, "Captain Thorne's techniques are being studied by Special Forces instructors who are amazed by her tactical creativity. She's changed how we think about survival and resistance training." The Special Forces community, which had traditionally been skeptical of conventional military capabilities, found themselves studying Viper's techniques with the kind of professional interest typically reserved for legendary operators. Her innovations were being incorporated into advanced training programs that would benefit the most elite military units. The mountain where Viper had fought her legendary battle was designated as a permanent training site, with tactical scenarios developed to replicate the conditions that had made her success possible. But the most important element was the psychological preparation that emphasized mental toughness over physical characteristics. Captain Rodriguez, a Marine Corps instructor who had been assigned to develop new training protocols, provided his assessment of the lessons learned. Captain Thorne's engagement proves that tactical success depends on preparation, creativity, and the willingness to exceed conventional limitations. These are attributes that transcend gender boundaries. The training programs that emerged from this analysis would benefit countless service members who would face similar challenges in future conflicts. But more importantly, they established new standards for what was possible when military personnel were evaluated based on capability rather than perception. The congressional hearings that followed Viper's engagement were conducted with the gravity typically reserved for matters of national security. But the questions being asked weren't about tactical procedures or strategic implications. They were about the fundamental assumptions that had governed military policy for decades. Senator Margaret Chen, the chairwoman of the Armed Services Committee, opened the hearings with a statement that would be quoted in military academies for generations. "Captain Thorne's actions have provided definitive proof that our previous policies regarding women in combat were based on assumptions rather than evidence. Today, we have the evidence." The testimony that followed included tactical analysis, psychological assessment, and strategic evaluation of what had occurred on that mountain. But the most powerful evidence was the simple fact that a single injured pilot had defeated a superior enemy force through superior tactics and unwavering determination. General Richardson's testimony was particularly significant. Captain Thorne's performance exceeded that of most Special Forces personnel under similar conditions. Her success was a function of training, preparation, and mental toughness, attributes that have nothing to do with gender and everything to do with professional excellence. The policy changes that emerged from these hearings would reshape military culture in ways that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Women would be evaluated based on their capabilities rather than their gender, with assignments made according to merit rather than traditional assumptions. The ripple effects of Viper's Mountain battle continued to spread through military and civilian institutions alike. Military academies revised their curricula to emphasize the tactical and psychological elements that had made her successful. Defense contractors developed new training programs that incorporated her innovations. Most importantly, cultural attitudes began to shift in ways that would benefit countless service members. The documentary film that was eventually produced about the engagement would be shown in military training facilities worldwide, serving as both tactical instruction and inspirational example. But for the women currently serving in military roles, the most important message was that their capabilities were no longer subject to question. At the Air Force Academy, the same classroom where General Stone had shown Viper's photograph was now filled with cadets who understood that their own potential was limited only by their preparation, training, and willingness to exceed expectations. The theoretical arguments about women in combat had been replaced by historical fact. The mountain in Afghanistan where Viper had fought her legendary battle had been renamed Thorn Ridge in recognition of what had occurred there. But the most important memorial was the knowledge that her actions had created opportunities for countless other service members who would follow in her footsteps. The final chapter of this story was still being written, with each successful mission flown by women pilots, each tactical innovation implemented by female officers, and each barrier broken by service members who had been inspired by her example. She had proven that excellence knows no gender boundaries, and that legacy would endure long after her service had ended. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of women's roles in combat, they would point to a specific date and location: the mountains of Kandahar province, where Captain Kira, Viper, Thorne proved that excellence knows no gender boundaries. Her actions had answered every question about women's capabilities in ground combat, establishing precedents that would benefit countless service members for generations to come. The Taliban fighters who had underestimated her capabilities had paid the ultimate price for their assumptions. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. It had provided the definitive proof that military effectiveness transcended gender boundaries, and that excellence was a function of preparation, training, and determination, rather than physical characteristics. Captain Kira, Viper, Thorne had accomplished something that transcended tactical victory. She had proven that excellence knows no boundaries and that determination can overcome any obstacle. Her legacy would endure in the policies she helped shape, the precedents she established, and the countless service members who would benefit from her example. The story of her mountain battle would be told and retold in military academies, training facilities, and command centers around the world. But the most important audience would be the young women who would choose military service, knowing that their capabilities were no longer subject to question, and that their potential was limited only by their own determination to exceed expectations. In the end, the mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed the birth of a new era in military service, one where excellence was measured by performance rather than perception, and where the only limitations that mattered were those imposed by preparation, training, and the willingness to exceed conventional expectations. Captain Viper Thorne had changed the conversation about women in combat forever, and her legacy would endure for generations to come.